So some major auto news broke last night, and that is that Ferrari had a sudden and unexpected CEO change. So in this video, we're going to talk about what this means for a potential IndyCar program in the next couple of years. Does it change anything? Does it change nothing? We're going to talk about that. So first, let's establish what has taken place in the last 24 hours and then expand on that. So the now former Ferrari CEO, Louis Camilleri, abruptly retired from Ferrari, citing personal reasons last night. Now, why this is important to IndyCar and the potential of an IndyCar-Ferrari partnership is that he was the last Ferrari executive to publicly comment on an IndyCar program, and he did that in the New York Times. Now, we're going to go back to a previous video of mine and play you a clip of what he said in regards to IndyCar, just so we know where things stood when Camilleri was the CEO of Ferrari in regards to IndyCar. Now, the first quote of note comes from Camilleri, and he says, "We're studying Indy. It depends somewhat on the flexibility in terms of their future regulations," he added, noting that the chassis and aerodynamics are pretty standard, which we understand they've done at a cost containment exercise. Now, here's the quote that really seals the deal and really informs that previous quote about Ferrari's involvement in IndyCar, and it's on the possible involvement of Ferrari in Formula E. "We don't necessarily feel it's road relevant. While a lot of Formula E is very standardized, we'd like to go places we can differentiate ourselves. It's hard to see where you can get a competitive edge." He says that about Formula E. Now, talking in more detail about the connections between Camilleri and IndyCar, you have to look at his chairman of the board position at Philip Morris International and why that is important. And of course, he's also stepped down from this duty as well, is that Philip Morris is not only the primary sponsor of Ferrari's Formula One team, but they have serious Penske Corporation ties. Roger Penske himself was formerly on that board of directors and currently has a surrogate from the Penske Automotive Group on the board as we speak. So there were some serious corporate connections between Philip Morris, Ferrari, and Penske. And of course, some of those still remain, but they may not be as strong right now with Camilleri out of the picture. So Ferrari didn't waste any time getting a replacement in place, at least on a temporary basis. They went with a guy named John Elkann. Now, this is important. This guy is an American, Italian-American, of course, because it is Ferrari after all, but he was born in New York City. Now, some of his other duties across the business world is that he's the chairperson of the Fiat Chrysler empire. Of course, they're deeply entrenched with Ferrari as well. And perhaps even more importantly, or most importantly, this is the second time he has filled in at this position. The first time was just a couple of years ago when Sergio Marchionne left Ferrari in bad health and eventually, unfortunately, died as a result of his health crisis. Now, Marchionne is a very interesting character when talking in regards to Fiat Group or Ferrari or any of those particular brands joining IndyCar, because he was very much in talks just a couple of years ago about getting a Fiat brand, most likely Alfa Romeo, into IndyCar racing. So, as we know, this would be the second Ferrari CEO in a row that have not been there on an interim basis, that have talked very, very seriously about bringing a program to the United States, and particularly to IndyCar. Of course, Camilleri went a step further and used the Ferrari brand, but Elkann actually handpicked Camilleri to replace him at that interim position. Of course, made Camilleri the main CEO, or the permanent CEO. Now, despite the American connection, obviously Elkann is an American citizen, born in New York, and of course that's also the neck of the woods which Roger Penske is from. There's no obvious connections between Elkann and the Penske Corporation. Now, of course, Roger Penske certainly has dealerships, and I would imagine that there would be some sort of a business connection there, but there's been no obvious partnership. There's been no interviews together. There's been no mention in the New York Times of these two having any kind of truly a personal business relationship between the two, unlike you could look at with Camilleri and Philip Morris. And maybe another red flag here is that Elkann really doesn't seem to have much racing interest personally, outside of, believe it or not, yacht racing. Probably the only thing that's just about as expensive as Formula One in terms of, and certainly as exclusive as Formula One. But I would assume with John Elkann in there as an interim, he will eventually name another replacement. But does that mean it's a bad sign 100% for IndyCar? I'm going to say no, and here's why. Well, number one's the obvious. Dude's American. And I would imagine that even as an interim CEO of Ferrari and the permanent CEO of Fiat Chrysler, being an American, the American market is very important, certainly for any business, much less if it's run by an American or not. And I have to think, given his last two choices of CEO for the Ferrari company, you look at it, and both of them seem to be exploring possibilities in the American market. You had Marchione, I can't remember, I have to look at the board, but the previous CEO, who unfortunately had health issues which sidelined him from Ferrari, looked at bringing Alfa Romeo into IndyCar. That actually, I remember talking about that 2 or 3 years ago. That apparently got very close, and it was ultimately the death, the ill health and death that actually prevented that from going across the finish line. So from that perspective, yeah, maybe I am worried because Camilleri is out at Ferrari. He was the guy who seemed to be currently the front runner in terms of commenting on an IndyCar possibility for Ferrari. And certainly, once Elkann puts another CEO or installs another CEO into Ferrari, there's no guarantee that they are going to be whatsoever interested in talking to Roger Penske or have any interest in auto racing. They could put a CEO in there who's like, yeah, you know what, we're going to go to Formula E. You're going to pull out of Ferrari or Formula One, and we're going to go to Formula E. You know, just something crazy. You never know. You never know 100%. But the fact that there's an American presumably going to call the shots here, you would assume that they're going to put somebody in there who at least understands the importance of the American market. So that would be an important one. And we also have to keep in mind that Ferrari wasn't talking about this just because of the American market. They're talking about this because of the Formula One budget cap. They spend an enormous amount of money on Formula One development. And in order to prevent them from losing a lot of jobs or costing the Italian people a lot of jobs, they decided that they were going to look very seriously about expanding. Now, whether that was World Endurance Championship or IndyCar, whatever, they've talked a hell of a lot more about IndyCar, which seems to indicate, based on everything we seem to know about the European manufacturers, particularly Ferrari, the ones that they put into the media are ordinarily the ones that they're really taking a serious look at. We know that Roger Penske was in serious conversations. In fact, I do wonder now about that Italian report if they had some sort of a tip-off about these health crisis, this crisis with Camilleri and his exit, and used that to say, well, yeah, now the IndyCar program's not happening, or maybe they know who might be tapped to replace Camilleri on a permanent basis, or maybe they know that Elkann doesn't like IndyCar. I don't know. It definitely leads a bit of credence to that Italian report, even despite the fact that, of course, the Penske Corporation shot that down and said, no, we're still talking to Ferrari. We're still in conversations with Ferrari to bring them into the series. This is going to be something we're going to be tracking, certainly on this channel, seeing where this goes, seeing who ends up becoming the permanent CEO, whether they have any connections to Philip Morris, whether they have any connections to Roger Penske, whether they have any connections to IndyCar, auto racing, all of that sort of stuff. It's all going to play into whether or not this Ferrari thing actually happens or not. But I would certainly speculate that this certainly has thrown a wrench into things, to say the very least. We'll have to keep track of it and see what happens in the future. So thank you guys so much for watching. This has been Dave Land on YouTube. Subscribe for more motorsport content, and I will see you in the next video.